Good evening. For the second time in a week, US President Donald Trump has made America do a U-turn on a stated policy. After scrapping his predecessor's climate change policy, the Trump administration has stunned allies with its position on Syria. Removing Assad from power is no longer a priority. Beating the Islamic State is. Critics, both internationally and from his own party, have called this move a grave mistake and a gift to Russia. On the ground, the US-led offensive has intensified amid reports that Syria has seen the biggest displacement of people since the Second World War. On Gravitas tonight, we discuss endgame Syria and what it entails for all sides. The headlines first. Another twist in the Russia-Trump story. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn says he has a story to tell, but will do so only if he gets immunity from prosecution. 24 people killed, 100 injured as another blast rocked through a Shiite mosque full of Friday worshippers in northwest Pakistan's Parchinar area. For the second time in a month, China warns India of serious damage in bilateral ties if the Dalai Lama visits Arunachal Pradesh. Delhi remains firm. Frankfurt makes the most of Brexit as UK-based banks look to relocate jobs. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley among those shifting thousands of jobs to the city from London. First, climate change and now Syria. US President Donald Trump sure is undoing Obama's work. Two statements in quick succession left no doubt whatsoever about his government and his country's new stand on Assad. Getting him out is no longer their objective. Defeating ISIS is. This goes against the former president and his allies' repeatedly stated position. Listen in to US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson.
I think the status and the longer term status of President Assad will be decided by the Syrian people.
Earlier, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley said, and I quote, "We cannot necessarily focus on Assad the way that the previous administration did. Do we think he's a hindrance? Yes. Are we going to sit there and focus on getting him out? No." Reactions, of course, followed, not just from fellow Republicans, but international allies like Britain and France, who said that Assad is not and cannot be the future of the country. Republican Senator John McCain, who chairs the Senate Armed Services Committee, said, and I quote again, "Tillerson's statement overlooks the tragic reality that the Syrian people cannot decide the fate of Assad or the future of their country when they are being slaughtered by Assad's military, Russia's Air Force, and Iranian-backed militias." Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said that this is a great reward for Russia and Iran. And joining us this evening, R. Dayakar, former ambassador of India to Iraq and Jordan, with me in the studio. Good evening and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
James M. Dorsey, senior fellow, RSIS, joining us from Singapore, and Glenn Carl, security analyst, former CIA official, with us from Boston this evening. Good evening to everyone. Glenn Carl, is this a gift for Russia, as Lindsey Graham said?
Well, I think that's certainly part of it, yes. And when one looks at Donald Trump's statements and actions from the time he entered the public political arena to today with this announcement, literally every step and statement he has made has been in line with almost verbatim the positions of the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Russian Intelligence Service. It is quite shocking. Yes, now, one can make a case that the policy serves American interests, but it is notable that once again, it is perfectly in line with what Russia is doing. So I think we're finding Senator McCain rising to what I think is maybe his finest moment in his public career, with his consistent role of trying to speak truth to power in the American public and internationally about what's happening with American international policies as a result of Donald Trump.
James Dorsey, what explains this shift according to you?
Well, first of all, I'm not quite sure how much of a shift it is. I think de facto, from the moment that the Russians intervened in Syria, that de facto the United States, but also U.S. allies in the Gulf, were looking at a situation in which the question was not whether or not Bashar al-Assad would be in place once the guns fell silent, but how long and under what conditions the transition period would take, and what role Bashar al-Assad would play in that. The other point of this is, I'm not, yes, there is the whole issue of Trump's relationships with Russia, but I want to leave that aside. Bashar al-Assad, once the guns do fall silent, and you do have some kind of agreement, is damaged goods. I think, first of all, you may see the knives come out for him from within his own group. Second of all, he will be a pariah and not of all that much use to either the Iranians or the Russians. So, in a sense, you've gotten here a statement which reaffirms the Russian position, but the Americans in Syria today are only focused on the Islamic State. They're not focused on the future of Syria, and that's their problem. Because to really defeat the Islamic State, you're going to have to deal with the rest of Syria.
Right. Ambassador Dayakar, I'm quoting from what a senior Trump official said. He said the move reflects a measure of just realism, accepting the facts on the ground. Assad is never going to have sufficient force to reassert control over the whole country. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, there is a background to the whole thing. There have been negotiations going on in Geneva and so on, and Assad has been seen for long as a part of the problem rather than the solution. And the Iranians were very rigid in supporting Assad, and the Russians had shown some flexibility. So at this point of time, the stand taken by the United States is not really a gift for Russia, but it's an unintended benefit to Iran. Assad is going to stay on, but in the process, America has alienated the friends in the Gulf, the distrust, or the credibility of the stability of American foreign policy would be in greater doubt. Having said that, the Assad is given only a temporary reprieve. Once ISIS, Islamic State, is neutralized, which is an open question, and then the next turn would obviously be to pay attention to Assad. And then the Israeli position is also crucial. Israel is neutral in this matter about the Assad's future. So my view is that this is not going to be a big game changer in the Syrian question, in the Assad's future, because it was always in doubt. But it's a question of time how he faced out. It's a kind of face saver for Assad, and the compulsions America is facing in fighting ISIS. By the way,
why give a face saver for Assad? Why now?
Because he would have to go, but over time, because they have not said that he will stay on. Let the fight ISIS. By the way, that gives certain interest for Assad to prolong the life of ISIS, because his longevity is linked to ISIS surviving. If ISIS vanishes, then he gets attention of all the people. So it's a very complicated, lot of twists and turns in the West Asian situation. This yet one more twist.
Right. So is this a shift or not? That is also an important question. Glenn Carr, let me quote from Robert Ford, who resigned in 2014 as the U.S. ambassador to Syria. And he said that the government's policy since late 2014 for the past 3 years has been to focus more specifically on the fight against the Islamic State as well as the Al-Qaeda. And I'm quoting again, even if it never acknowledged that its focus on Syria had shifted, the Trump administration is only following the same path. Is that it, that Donald Trump spelt it out while Obama did not?
Well, I think my colleagues have made excellent points, and there's a lot of truth to what the quote that you just read. I think it was 1 year ago, almost exactly, give or take a couple of months, that Secretary of State for I was going to say Clinton, no, for Obama, Kerry was announcing a seeming arrangement with the Russians that Assad would remain in power, and that the way to defeat ISIS was to work with the Russians, Iranians de facto, and Syria. And the Syrian regime has been the only potential coherent body to replace or to fill the vacuum that ISIS would leave once it is destroyed. So those things are true, and in that sense, Trump's statements are in some ways saying openly what was at least talked about before or tentatively moved towards. Now, that initial tentative agreement fell apart very quickly when Russian activities and objectives didn't coincide with Americans and vice versa. But the problem is, what power is there? And now it's also worth, I'll just, I think, reiterate what we've heard, that even if Assad does stay in power, no one is really enamored of him. And the talk was that he might have a dacha in the Crimea a few months after what amounts to peace happens after the end of ISIS. It's hard to know which direction to go, since there is no good one. And you could argue that Tillerson is just making explicit what the realities might have to be. That is, I think, a fair statement.
Right, so Assad is no more really a force to reckon with. James Dorsey, is this then a win for Iran and Russia, as many are pointing out?
Well, I think it's a short-term win in any case. I think middle and long term, we'll have to wait and see. I don't think that whatever happens, Assad is sustainable. I don't think that the Russians are necessarily wed to Assad. And the relationship, frankly, between Assad and Putin is not all that great, the chemistry. And I'm not convinced that the Iranians are necessarily wed to Assad. So I think it's really a wait and see. It's a bit early to draw a lot of conclusions from this.
Right. So, Ambassador Dayakar, is America being myopic when it says we only want to focus on ISIS but not care about the rest of Syria? Because, you know, this is like a Game of Thrones, if I may, but there are human lives involved and lakhs of them.
No, it's certainly not myopic. It's a well calculated in terms of the available options. They cannot fight both Assad and ISIS at the same time. Both are enemies and to United States, and they're enemies to each other. So it is, I think, a step by step. ISIS is seen as a bigger threat than Assad.
You're saying it's a wise move?
It's a realistic move, but not necessarily wise, because I don't see ISIS is on the death throes. Iraq, it's virtually finished. And Syria, it's facing on multiple fronts, the opposition, the Turks, and the Syrian government, and the American and the allied aerial attack. So at this point of time, to make a choice between the two, it's a little late. It should have taken place earlier in fighting the ISIS. Now, there is really no need, in my view, in military terms, to fight ISIS. You need to bring down the target of Assad. Assad is basically a political target. It's not a military target, because in negotiations, they want him to step down, first place, the Western things. Of course, there have been nuanced changes in the position. Initially, they were very rigid. He should go. Then they slowly said, no, he has to go later. After time, talking of transitional government and so on. So I would not see a big, it's again one of those twists and turns, as I said, taking place, but I don't think it's going to make a effect of a game changer in the entire thing. But it will have some collateral damage to the American foreign policy. The allies in the region, they begin doubting, because there is no continuity, there is no stability. And second thing, they might start making kind of overtures to Assad or Iran, or kind of diplomatic overtures to see, because Assad is going to stay there in the region. So there are a lot of implications and ramifications stemming about, as one of the panelists said, we have to wait and see what will come out.
Right. You mentioned the allies. James Dorsey, Britain and France have already said that their position vis-a-vis Assad remains unchanged. How do you then see the coalition forces going forward?
Well, I think there are two things that I want to say and put this in a bit of a broader context. First of all, the relationship with U.S. allies in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia actually already had made Syria less of a priority. Yemen, Iran were much more important priorities for it. And in some ways had started to come to think about a situation in which Bashar may survive for a period of time. What I think the real question is, and I don't know that I have the answer to that, is why were these statements made by Tillerson and by Nick Haley at this point? There really was no need to make them. And so I don't quite understand why they made it. Now, I'm sure that the Brits and the French and others in Europe will maintain the position that they've had on Syria, but I don't know that really all that much on the ground changes.
That seems to have become the Trump administration's style, keep everyone guessing. But this is, as I've been saying, about people on the ground. The U.S., we know, has deployed additional troops, 1,000 according to some reports, for the Raqqa offensive in Syria that is expected soon. Civilian casualties have already soared, causing panic among people. Here's a report on the worsening humanitarian crisis in the region.
From the desert battlefields of Mosul in Iraq to Raqqa in Syria, the Islamic State appears to be in retreat. Its fighters are under pressure everywhere and civilians are in full flight. Raqqa in Syria is a little harder as the Islamic State fighters are not allowing people to leave, preferring they remain at gunpoint if necessary to serve as human shields. And some die in US or coalition airstrikes, as on this mosque in Al-Jina.
حوالي الساعة 7 مساء قام طيران تحالف مجهول بقصف مسجد سيدنا عمر بن الخطاب. أدى هذا القصف إلى استشهاد أكثر من 35 شهيد. ما زال العشرات من المفقودين تحت الأنقاض. فرق الدفاع المدني الآن تقوم باستخراج العالقين.
Mosul residents are still counting the losses of a US airstrike on March 17th, in which at least 200 people have been reported dead, including women and children.
The most deadly incident occurred on the 17th of March, when an airstrike, reportedly targeting ISIL snipers and equipment, hit a house in Al-Jadida neighborhood in western Mosul city. Witnesses reported that ISIL had previously forced at least 140 civilians into the house to be used as human shields.
US media reports said that the higher casualties were the result of looser rules of engagement. US field commanders are being allowed to determine when to call in airstrikes. US officials have admitted to ramping up their airstrikes. US units admitted using artillery and mortars. Clearly, the need to protect civilians is becoming less important as field commanders prioritize the protection of their own troops. Bureau Report, WION.
Glenn Carl, the offensive over the past few weeks has intensified despite mounting civilian casualties. We've seen it in Mosul. Raqqa is bracing for it. Is this then the new military strategy that no matter what the collateral damage, finish the operation?
Well, I think you could say that, yes. I think this, combined with the discussion we just had on the political, diplomatic objectives, fit well within what are fundamental differences in approach of Trump from Obama. Obama sought to end the civil war, defeat ISIS, and create stability. The problem was, with what body and entity could that occur? And the answer was with none, really, while not engaging American forces indefinitely there. Trump's approach is almost straightforward clash of civilizations, projection of military power equals success approach. So Assad becomes more acceptable, and collateral damage is something that is more acceptable. Let's take the tactical approach of defeating the opponent whom we've defined as radical Islam as embodied by ISIS, and not worry about, because it's frankly not part of their relevant concerns, the longer-term consequences in the broader society of, or societies of Syria and the Middle East. So it does fit. It is debatable, but it does fit in the change that Trump said that he would bring.
Ambassador Dayakar, is the refugee situation then expected to worsen given the way things are moving? There's a lot of panic, according to ground reports, in these regions, both in Iraq and Syria.
I would say the internal displacement would take place to a greater degree, but not, I think, moving out of Syria. Again, for reasons, there are, what's happening in Europe and America, the anti-immigrant sentiments, anti-immigration. But within Syria, there will be heavy internal displacement, and neighbors, Jordan, probably Iraq, could take some refugees. But the sufferings definitely would increase. By the way, this is not, I think, a deliberate policy to hit the civilians. I don't think it's a change of rules in engagement. I believe it's a genuine mistake.
But the airstrikes in Mosul.
Mosul, yes. Airstrike, the civilian casualties you're referring to, because they are taken hostage by the ISIS people. If you are to hit the ISIS, inevitable. They want to keep to the minimal. It's not, I don't think that would anyway, it will become counterproductive, targeting the civilians, either as part of the rules of engagement and sort of, or to scare them out, because they've given them enough options to move out. Of course, this gives certain propaganda advantage to ISIS and their people, but it's a temporary setback in the fighting, in the thing, but it's inevitable in a war situation. If you want to end ISIS, it's unfortunate. Extremely unfortunate.
Hundreds of people, including women and children, have
140
been killed.
people.
Yes.
And it's a one time. I don't think it happened consistently. It didn't previously. I know I'm not justifying that one.
You only die once.
No, I'm not justifying that. It's condemnable, definitely, in the sense that if it is deliberate, and if it is intended to achieve some objective, targeting civilians, absolutely, it's condemnable. But in a situation like that, it's always also happened. Civilians. Ramadi, Rudda, but of course the Iraqi forces did it, not the American thing. So it's very unfortunate, extremely unfortunate, 140 people, children and women.
According
but
to some
then
reports,
the blame goes
the
to
toll is higher,
Islamic State.
Yeah, okay, I'll take that. James Dorsey, where does this leave the people who raised the banner of revolt against Bashar al-Assad?
Up a creek at this point, frankly. Let me just go back to one thing, that's the humanitarian situation. And obviously what happened in Mosul is horrible. But to be frank, we have been watching for 6 years a conflict go on in which roughly 500,000 people have been killed and 5 million people have been displaced. And what we're seeing now is simply, as cynical as that may sound, a continuation of that. I think that those who are opposing Assad, that is to say, those who are counting on Western support, and particularly U.S. support, are up a creek. I think there are two factors that we shouldn't forget. One is the Kurds, who have their own interests and will not simply disappear. And you have very strong factions, maybe even the strongest factions among those opposed to Assad, which are those which are still or formerly associated with Al-Qaeda.
Right. Well, we'll see how this plays out and how the allies respond in the days ahead. And of course, the question: why did they have to say it now? If they've been doing it for 3 years, why spell it out now and well, make headlines? But thanks very much, R. Dayakar, James Dorsey, Glenn Carl. Thank you very much for joining us here on Gravitas. We're taking a short break. We'll be back with lots more.